We're ready to start Unit 2 now. During the next several sessions, we'll be considering gender identity and sexual orientation. I'll start out discussing the difference and the intersection of these two concepts. Then we'll spend some time considering the historical perspective of homosexuality so students can understand its basis on religious doctrine. We'll also consider medical and political issues that have shaped our ideas and the ongoing legal issues which are a part of our political landscape right now. Finally, we'll also discuss transgender issues and the concept of intersex, which challenges the traditional notions of two sexes. We will be starting the second unit talking about gender identity and sexual orientation and distinguishing those from sex. Starting off the concept of sex. Sex is something that is completely biological. It's driven by your DNA and it becomes encoded in your body in primary and secondary sexual characteristics. The primary sexual characteristics are your genitals. The secondary sexual characteristics are things like development of a deeper voice in men, more hair in men, more fat padding on the hips for women, so that your sex is biologically determined to the most part by your DNA. And we'll challenge that idea when we get to the very end of this unit and we start talking about issues of intersex. But for now, let's just keep it thinking about your sex being determined by your DNA, and then your DNA starts physiological processes in your body, and those further determine your secondary sexual characteristics. Gender, on the other hand, is much more cultural. Gender identity is speaking to the sex that you identify with. So most sociologists would argue that gender identity is something that's culturally acquired. We're taught gender identity. We aren't born with a gender identity, but we learn it through the cultural process. So gender identity is not necessarily biologically determined. It's something that we learn. In contrast to gender identity is sexual orientation. And sexual orientation is referring to the type of person we are romantically attracted to, the sex or possibly the gender of the person that we're romantically attracted to. So that's the person that we're choosing for sexual activity. So gender identity and sexual orientation are two things that are very different and distinctive from each other. Now we are taught to think about sex as two distinct, mutually exclusive categories. Simple there, boys and girls, males and females. Again, we'll challenge that when we talk about intersex later on in this unit. But in general, we tend to think about sex as these two mutually exclusive categories. The social expectation is that the individual is going to have either a male or a female gender identity that matches their sex. So the norm or the expectation by society is that gender identity and biological sex should match. In general, children start to learn their gender identity about the age of 2. Between the ages of 2 and 3, little boys and little girls start to understand that they should engage in certain types of behaviors because they're either a boy or a girl. In contrast to that, our sex drive generally emerges much later in life. We don't start feeling sexual attractions until we start going through puberty at about age 12 or 13, possibly a little bit earlier. Now, as I said before, gender identity does not necessarily correspond with biological genitalia. It doesn't correspond with your biological makeup, whether you were imprinted by your DNA to be either a girl or a boy. So when gender identity does not correspond with biological sex, then we have other categories that we refer to, such as transgender, transsexual, or possibly intersex if there is ambiguity as to what the primary sex characteristics of the child is. I also want to bring up the concept of cisgender. So when we talk about transgender, we're talking about individuals whose sexual identity does not match their biological sex. So the corollary there is that when someone's gender identity matches their biological sex, that's called cisgender. Finally, I want to mention the idea of transgender and genderqueer, and that these terms are sometimes used to refer to individuals that are not subscribing to traditional gender roles. Sometimes the term of gender bending is used, and that's also used to describe people whose biological sex does not match their gender identity. So in Native American culture, we have a group called the Burdash, which has recently been relabeled as two-spirited. The two-spirited person is a man who assumes the role of a woman, and in Native American culture, they're an individual that is honored and considered to have special spiritual connections in Native American culture. So that if a Native American tribe did not have a two-spirited person within their tribe, that was actually considered a loss to the tribe. That was a position of honor and something that all tribes wanted and hoped to have at least one, if not more, two-spirited individuals in their tribe. That's something that's not necessarily unique just to Native American culture. You'll find that also in India in the groups called the Hira, in Oman in groups called the Zanith, and also in Polynesian culture, groups that are called the Fa'afafini. So in contrast to gender identity is the concept of sexual orientation. That's referring to who you select as a partner for your sexual, romantic, and emotional attractions. We have different categories in the U.S. We discuss these categories in terms of heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and we also refer now to groups that are called questioning. So when you're talking about BLTQ as categories of difference, the Q generally is referring to questioning. Another important aspect of sexual orientation to understand is that it can change throughout the life course. It can be fluid. So in some people it may be fixed. They may be heterosexual or homosexual their entire life. For other individuals it may change over their lifespan. And the first researcher to understand that was Alfred Kinsey. He did his studies in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, and his studies established this idea that sexual orientation is not a fixed characteristic. It is not something that is static. So he challenged the notion that people were either homosexual or heterosexual. He decided that these two categories were social constructs and that people actually weren't that label, but rather they just engaged in those behaviors, and that those behaviors were fluid, they weren't static, and they might change over time.